Good evening, everyone. I apologize. We were having some technical difficulty, but it is now my pleasure to welcome you to the Broomfield Library's One Book, One Broomfield program. I'm Suzanne Linder, the Library Programming Manager for the City and County of Broomfield. One Book, One Broomfield is a community-wide reading program made possible by the contributions of many people. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge those who helped make this year's program possible. The One Book Steering Committee's hard work and passion for the program is what makes it possible year after year. Thank you for everything you do. This year, the One Book Committee would especially like to recognize the contributions of longtime member Jan Kodatsky, who passed away earlier this year. Thank you, Jan. None of this would be possible without the talented and hardworking staff in the Library and Cultural Affairs Department and throughout the City and County of Broomfield. Thank you all for bringing your best every day for Broomfield. Ms. Alvarez will be in conversation this evening with Esperanza Chairez Uriarte. Esperanza is a Chicana of Puerto Rico descent and an aspiring writer. She divides her time grant writing for a Latino arts and cultural organization based in Denver and farming in the Southwest New Mexico along the US-Mexico border. One quick note, signed copies of Afterlife are available for purchase online from Book Bar in Denver. Book Bar is a fantastic independent bookstore and a partner to us for these author events. Please enter the word bookplate into the shopping cart comments box when checking out. And now it is my privilege to introduce Mayor Guyleen Castriata, who will say a few words and introduce our guest author.
As mayor, and on behalf of the City and County of Broomfield, I would like to welcome you to the 16th One Book, One Broomfield Community Reading Program. This year's selection is Afterlife by Julia Alvarez, a hopeful novel interlaced with themes of sisterhood, grief, and immigration. Julia Alvarez is a Dominican-American poet, novelist, and essayist. Her writings include the bestsellers In the Time of Butterflies and How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents. She has won numerous awards, including the Pura Belpre and Americas Awards for her books for young readers. Add to these the Hispanic Heritage Award, the F. Scott Fitzgerald Award, and the National Medal of Arts. Afterlife was one of Time magazine's must-read books of 2020 and garnered rave reviews in the New York Times, Library Journal, the Washington Post, and many other websites and publications. Our One Book, One Broomfield selection was decided by a community vote this year, and Afterlife was a clear winner. The strong themes of family and discussions this title generated clearly resonated with the Broomfield community. I also want to say how much I appreciate the work and efforts of the One Book, One Broomfield Selection Committee to feature this title. Thank you. Now I'm pleased to present Julia Alvarez.
Hi, Julia.
Hi, Esperanza.
It's so good to finally have you on screen with us. I think there was a little bit of technological difficulties, and thank you so much to those who figured it out. Thank you to the Broomfield Library and its staff for reaching out to community organizations, which is how I ended up here this evening. And it was really cool to hear that this book was selected through a community vote and that it resonated so much with Broomfield's community. And yeah, thank you for writing this beautiful and intimate novel. It's very honest and timely. And yeah, it was published in early 2020, right?
Yes.
Which I find interesting because its publication sort of coincided with COVID-19 becoming this global emergency and all these states in the US implementing lockdowns. And collectively, I don't think any of us could have possibly prepared for the depth of grief that COVID has brought to all of our lives in some way or another. And I find it interesting that it's entered the world, this book you've written, in such a period of immense disturbance and transformation. And I think that all of us can relate to Antonia in some way or another as she struggles to piece her life together and figure out a new normal, right? And so Afterlife fundamentally and powerfully deals with grief. And my first question for you is kind of, in what ways has your own perception of your novel changed since its publication and in the midst of navigating the pandemic?
Great question, Esperanza. First, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. And apologies to the community that we had to cancel the first time, but here we are. And to the One Book, One Broomfield committee for selecting Afterlife. It's a really good question, because when COVID closed everything down, and I thought, oh my goodness, did I have a crystal ball? And I think there's a way in which writers are picking up the zeitgeist of their time. And I feel like the pandemic brought to the fore all the many ways that things were falling apart in the planet, in our countries, in our communities, everything from climate change, the extinction of species, communities being devastated by fires and floods, people having to be economic and ecological refugees. I mean, everything was already happening. Violence against communities of color, it was there. And when I was writing the novel, I felt like we were living in what I called, and this was pre-pandemic, elegiac times. Times when we were seeing the end of so many things, the breaking apart of so many things. And I felt like, I wanted to work for me, writing, storytelling is a way to not solve problems, but to understand them. And I don't mean with my head, in that kind of integrated way of head, heart, spirit. And I felt like I wanted to understand what does it mean to live in a time when things are falling apart. They are no longer working. We are seeing the end of so many things. How do you live through that time? And how do you not, sort of give into despair?
Right.
And continue with hope and resilience and try to come through to a larger version of who we can be. And that's Antonia's struggle. So yes, when the pandemic hit, I thought, oh my goodness, I should be an expert, but I wasn't.
Right. And as far as navigating grief and how it functions in our lives, especially when that grief can be so immense sometimes at the scale that you kind of just mentioned with this global catastrophe of not only the pandemic, but all these other sort of things going on in our lives pre-pandemic. So.
Right. And maybe the isolation and the slowing down allowed people to see what was already there. And I think that stories are a way to do that without having to have a pandemic,
right?
To reflect and understand and pay attention and become the other that we sometimes keep out of our lives, out of safety and fear and other reasons.
Yeah. I also think that beyond teaching us about grief and about this other, which I definitely want to get into in a bit, that COVID has also allowed many of us to realize that we aren't the isolated individuals that we like to think of ourselves as, that we exist in relation to one another. And I think Afterlife did an incredible job of exploring this idea of oneself in relation to others through Antonia's character. And so, Antonia's continuously, coming to understand herself as part of this sisterhood in relation to Sam, her husband who has died, to her former students. And at one point you write, it's not just the sisters with assigned roles, maybe it's part and parcel of being connected with others whom you have to discriminate a self from. So I was hoping that maybe you could talk a little bit more about the sisterhood in relation to US culture. And I wanted to ask if you think it's possible to write about identity without identifying, to use Izzy's air quotes, the other.
I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Is it possible to have identity without?
I guess, is it possible to write about identity without distinguishing an other? And also, if you could talk a little bit about the sisterhood in relation to U.S. culture.
That's such an interesting question. I'll have to think about that. I think the sisterhood and the being from another culture that very much thinks of itself communally as a we, as a familia, and not a nuclear family, but extended familia. And there's always that sense that you are a bead in the necklace of the generations. And then you come to this country where identity and self and, getting ahead, and sometimes the pull of familia is keeping you from making your way in the world and being a self. Those pulls really come to bear on an immigrant family many times that comes from this other culture, these different understandings of what creates a self. And I think for each of the sisters, they're so embroiled that sometimes Antonia says she doesn't know who she is without the other three there to figure it out with, and yet to also resist. So, there's that combination of group identity and then the larger poles where you have to think of what is the right thing for me? What is the, and Antonia feels selfish about it. What is the right thing for me to do? What's the good thing for me? And I think it's an interesting question, identity versus, once you start to create a very strong sense of identity there, then you are not the others that are not that identity. So how do you create a human family, a whole, with these individual identities not closing up and becoming their own kind of gated communities, in whatever form? And that's always the challenge, because we need our tribes, we need our circles, we need our communities, we need our familias, but we need to also keep going beyond that. And one of the things that friendship does, one of the values of friendships that, of course, Antonia discovers with Beth is that that in friendship, you get to invent a new narrative with someone who's not embedded in that original narrative that you came from. And therefore you expand. And the other way that I see that happening is through reading. In reading, what's reading, you become the other. And I don't mean you just understand the other, or, you are window shopping the other. In a really engrossing story or novel, you become that person. You are moving in the world through that body, and you never come out of a book as the same person that began reading it. And I think that's one of the things that I see as so valuable in narrative, one of the things it can do for us. But the other thing I need to say about these issues of identity, they're important, especially if you've been erased. The wonderful poet and memoirist Ocean Vuong says, you can't discard an identity that you've never been granted, that you've never been allowed to claim.
Right.
So it's already a kind of privilege to be able to say, that you need to get beyond that identity. You do need to claim it. You do need to understand it, because that's your roots. But then to expand it, and very much, as you mentioned, with the pandemic, we're forced to see that, the virus doesn't know that my identity is different from someone else's. It travels. We are together in this. And so we need to find ways of balancing our individual identities and ethnic and racial with a larger sense of, a beloved community, a world community. So, and it's never a done deal. That's what's hard. It's never, at each instance, you have to be balancing it and being true to that moment and that other that is before you.
Right. And I love how you kind of just spoke to kind of those two sides Antonia's kind of constantly finding herself in, as far as the sisterhood and also being proud of her culture and roots, but also trying to figure out what's best for her. And as like a person dealing with very distinct set of issues in front of her. And I love what you said about these issues of identity are important because of erasure. Like we can't just, at the same time, we can kind of think about our human identity, but still have to hone in and ground ourselves in the reality of the unequal worlds we live in and exist in, and how this topic of identity and identity politics, or however you want to phrase it, is still so important.
Well, that reminds me of the issue, when people would put up their signs, I heard in our community, Black Lives Matter. Well, all lives matter. Yeah, but it was focusing on an erasure that was very important. And we can't just broaden it and erase it again. We have to see it in order for it to feel like it's included. So it's a tricky balance there.
Yeah. And Antonia's constantly dealing with that, which is one of the things I loved most about her characters, just how she's like shifting constantly in her world. And I wanted to ask you what was kind of that process of writing Antonia's character, and maybe what was kind of something that surprised you in writing Antonia's character.
Well, I felt, I think in some of the earlier novels, how the Garcia girls lost their accents, I was trying to understand, muse, reflect upon the Latina immigrant experience, and what that was like. And part of it I had lived through and reflected upon in stories and poems. So in some sense, I had my hands around it. With Antonia, I was just trying to keep up. She was I was discovering, as the writer, I was also discovering things with Antonia about the situation she was in, about her character. So I felt like I wanted to be really accurate and not misrepresent. And, when you're writing for a while, when you're living for a while, little dishonesties creep in, things that you figured out and you just, have it all boxed up. And one of the things about Antonia is that she's constantly unpacking things that are little chestnuts or little pieces of poems and literature that have been her way of holding on. And they words start failing her. She's taught all these wonderful narratives and has all these abstract, beautiful ideas. But what happens when the character steps out of a novel and is someone in your garage or someone knocking at your door? And so I kept wanting the character to be challenged beyond my own safety zones as a writer. And so I was constantly discovering things. And I mean, you might have read at some point some of the copy for the novel that said, this is her first adult novel in 15 years.
Yeah.
I've been writing all along, but there was a way that I had not wanted to. I wanted to write a novel about an elder. I when I wrote Garcia Girls, there was like a vacuum on the shelf, a gap. When I was writing it, there were no multicultural novels, no novels about Latina women, immigrants. There were very few, and there was a gap on the shelf. And I always have been, I guess, motivated by silences. And I wasn't seeing that many novels about elders as protagonists, and specifically Latinx elders that weren't the sort of, cliche of the abuelita, the curandera, a really complicated woman who is trying to figure out who she is. And so I think that it took me, I had to do that as the writer. I was trying to understand this new landscape of being an elder in order to be able to create a character that reflected the full complexity of what I was experiencing. So it was taking me that long to integrate it.
Yeah, that was one of my questions you sort of answered just now, as you had told people that this was your first, or people have labeled it as your first novel as an elder, and what that's meant for you. So thank you for kind of speaking to that. And I also wanted to just talk about Estela and this topic of like language that came up for me, at least in the novel, and how Estela kind of pokes at Antonia's I guess, need to get the words right, and kind of just hyperfixation on language, especially because Estela brings in the Spanish piece to this otherwise novel in English. And I wanted to ask you, alongside this being your first novel from like an elder's perspective, your perspective as a multilingual writer, and how that kind of shapes your writing, your relationship to English and Spanish.
Well, that's something that I've lived long enough now that I've seen a change. I remember when I was a little younger than you, and I was writing in college, and I would have a Tia Rosa in a story, and it would be circled. And I was told that it was, I had to write in English. It has to be an Aunt Rose. And if you call a character Aunt Rose, she totally changes.
Yeah.
She's not Tia Rosa, and it used to be, and now I feel more comfortable that you have to italicize a word, that if you put in a word in Spanish, like big neon lights flashing, this is a foreign element. And so much of American English, and what I love is its ongoing hybridity and incorporation of languages and cadences and rhythms that come into it and transform it and make it richer. And so I feel like that for a long time, I felt like, well, to be an American writer, I had to shed that foreignness. And I could no more shed that foreignness than I could change my fingerprint, because it's the way I hear language. So a lot of times I think of myself as writing my Spanish and English, even not even with the Spanish words, but my understanding of sentences and cadences and how they move, how a paragraph moves, has so much to do with that origin language. It's the obvious way is when these Spanish words are part of the English. And in that I have to credit younger writers as like yourself doing it and saying, this is my English has my Spanish in it. We creating this kind of new, richer, hybrid language. Whereas before, you were sort of embarrassed that you were speaking Spanglish. And now I feel like, no, English is so much a language that is borrowed from everybody else, So I feel like that's been part of my growth as a writer, a multicultural, bilingual writer. Not, you were given the either or. As when I first came to this country in 1960, you became an American and you cut off your ties to the past. That was the old model of immigration, and that's not, as we were talking earlier, you can't keep things separate like that anymore. People travel back and forth, they move, they call each other on WhatsApp. We're all creating a kind of a new multicultural English at the level of words and rhythms. So yeah.
And I think that multicultural or like multilingual writing and way of using language kind of speaks to this, like you just said, this like interconnected world and almost like consciousness, right? And something I really liked about Afterlife that I wanted to ask you about was these like multiple narratives happening simultaneously. So there's this story with Izzy and this story with Estela and Mario, and it's all just happening at once, which of course creates this kind of, I mean, you're in Antonia's world of confusion and trying to figure out what to do. But I wanted to ask how you came to that sort of narrative structure, or why you chose to create these different simultaneously happening sort of narratives.
It's interesting, you know, I never quite understand how it is that stories, you sit down like Antonia in your little narrow path of what your plot is going to be. And all of a sudden, you know, she comes home from visiting the sister in Chicago and Izzy's disappearance, and the garage door lifts and surprise, there's Estela, you know, the girlfriend has appeared. And so part of it is that these characters start creating their own momentum. And I knew that I wanted to focus on someone who is, in a sense, living her afterlife. You know, all the ways in which she made meaning and made a name for herself in the world have fallen apart. You know, she's no longer teaching. She's retired. She's no longer married. She's a widow. She's no longer really feeling involved in writing. You know, it's sort of all of it has fallen away. And then, you know, but she tries to live by these things that she taught. And so what I wanted to do is bring to her doorstep the actual situations that force her to really question, what is it that narratives can do for us? What is it that living in a world of story and text and, you know, these beautiful enlarging concepts, how does that work in the world when a real situation comes up? And I very much wanted to deal with some of the issues in my own community. You know, we have a huge, you wouldn't think it, because Vermont has this reputation as and it is, you know, a predominantly white state. And yet for the last 20 years, most of the small farms are surviving because of an underground migrant worker population doing all the milking in the farms. And as a community member, I've been very involved in that community because we don't have Spanish services here. So everyone would know that, oh, she knows some Spanish, call her up. And so I got involved in that community. So I was very, very curious too about how that works, you know, how that underground migrant community interacts with an older immigrant like Antonia, who was a refugee, not an economic immigrant. You know, all the really fine points of immigration that often are swept into a just big, you know, conglomerate immigrants. And they're not, it's very, I wanted to get into the little particles of that.
Yeah, you write that literature has to pull its weight in the real world, and I really appreciated that because that's very clear in your writing and the kind of topics you're pulling from police brutality to these topics of immigration and Latinidad and healthcare, and I just really appreciate that, and how you put, it's a complex issue you bring up with Antonia's character, this refugee from the Dominican Republic versus these young, poor Mexican immigrants, right? And their two immigration sort of stories side by side. And how does Antonia navigate her own privilege and power is something that she's figuring out as someone who's a racialized subject in the US herself. And she's navigating that. And I guess since you've been writing about Latinidad for so long, or you've been trying to understand this problem, not solve it, but at least understand it, I was wondering if you could speak to that, this topic of Latinidad and how Antonia's navigating her privilege and power in the US.
Yeah, I think it's an important issue to really look at. When it's a kind of tokenism when people kind of finally see, let's say, a Latinx community, and it's all the same. It's not really, it's still erasure. And within that community, we have to look closely at, as happened with the movie In the Heights. It's not that you have Latinx actors, but are you sensitive to the issues of race within that community? It's not just you're representing Latinas or you're representing Latinx. What is it? What are the particularities of that? And how are you sensitive to the power structures within that community and the privileges? Because there's also class and race. And one of the things that we found out in the last election is, surprise, surprise. Some in the Latinx community voted for the Republicans, and they don't do that. It's a very complicated community, and to allow ourselves that full diversity is one of the ways that we don't erase each other, and we're sensitive to the issues within our own communities. Mm-hmm. And it's complicated because once you're sort of allowed in and you're one of the people that are given some measure of visibility and a voice, not to say that there isn't just a single story, that you are just one story. You're not representing everybody. And when you do that, and when you do that in writing, when you have a character that's just a stock character, it's not a good story. Right. It's got to be complex. So one of the things that I do think a lot about is identity politics, especially as an elder, because as you get older, you start to shed identities, sort of returning to the mother root, the core self. And so much of your life has been to create that identity. So that's something else I'm also interested in. What does that mean to be an elder, and to be in a way further or in another space in terms of identity?
Yeah.
Again, Esperanza, I wish I would tell you that I have answers now from having lived this long and been through so many different gyrations of cultural politics over time. Mm-hmm. When I got here, we weren't even a box you could check. It was of Spanish origin. And I always felt like, well, I'm not really from Spain. I'm sort of like passing myself off as a Spaniard. Right. And to see that still complicated ways of funneling people. And it's so wonderful that in the last census, so many people checked other, and filled in a ton of blanks, Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that you write, like the beauty of language, of words rightly chosen, are riddled with who we are, class and race and whatever will keep us. So we think safe on the narrow path that you described Antonia kind of falling herself into, or that's kind of how writing is until something out of the blue comes up, right? And I think that's how these conversations about identity are too, that we think that there's a right way to have them, or there's some sort of solution as far as maybe like increasing the number of categories we can assign to ourselves. And maybe that isn't a solution at all, but and appreciating how at the beginning of this conversation, you say that you write not to solve problems, but to understand them. And
Well, that's something else that I'm really, as I used to think when you got older, you were like this wise person who would know things. And the older I get, the less I know and the more I learn from younger people, and one of the things that I've talked about with my friends is the wonderful fluidity, which can be very confusing to so many things that we thought were either ors, thinking of gender, how gender is now such a fluid, such a spectrum. And you were a girl or a boy. And at any number of points in my life, I was a boy. I was a tomboy. That's what they were called. And then, once you were a señorita, you
Act like a señorita.
Yeah, you had to act like it. But that these terms are so fluid, and that's a wonderful liberation. But with that comes, such many confusions and complications and challenges as you try to navigate these things. And there's no little box either or that you can take refuge in, as Antonia is learning.
Yeah. I guess you're very, generous to say that you have a lot to learn from younger writers, and I really appreciate your perspective in writing Antonia's character as an elder, and I definitely want to take advantage of the fact that you're here in front of me and ask if you have any advice for a younger writer.
Well, first, I'm very curious about you, Esperanza, because you are a writer. Poetry or fiction, or?
I write short stories and poetry, yeah.
Short stories and poetry, and also a farmer.
I like farming, yeah.
What are you growing?
Well, we were just finishing the season, so we were growing a bunch of like fall and winter crops, so beets, turnips.
Well, I live with a farmer, so I'm constantly in awe of people who can grow things. As I say to Bill, if all the supply chains fail, and our friends have said this, and there's no place to go, they know where to go. They come here. We have shelves stocked with canning things, and the freezer's full of produce because Bill is a farmer. And so I've grown very appreciative of that. But I was trying to think of what would be my advice. If you can give advice to anyone, so much of life is what Rilke, and that was a book that really meant a lot to me growing up as a young writer, was Letters to a Young Poet by Rilke. And he said, live the questions. So much of it is figuring it out for yourself. But I just recently got an email from someone, a plaintive email with a story, and the writer said, my teacher tells me that I'm writing like telenovelas. And I said, first of all, don't let anybody shut you down and tell you that that what you're doing, put a label on it and dismiss you. First of all, if Shakespeare weren't Shakespeare, he would be writing telenovelas. Think of all those big dramatic murders and passions and people committing suicide and poisoning themselves.
And he wrote about that in Afterlife, about how Estela's like plot line was so ridiculous until but it's someone's reality somewhere. So
right. And telenovelas are part of our tradition, and these traditions have something to teach us. Spike Lee, in this wonderful comment he made in an interview, said that one of the great lessons in his life is that you can learn things from people who are dumber than you, or you think they're dumber than you. And I think that some of the things I learned about storytelling, I learned growing up from people, some of them didn't really know how to read or write, but they were great oral storytellers.
Yeah.
And that's a tradition that is part of our literary canon, to use Izzy's air quotes, they are part of us. So
Yeah.
I think not to let, not to let anybody shut you down, and to follow that passion, because Howard Thurman was asked, what recommendation he gives to young people. What does the world need? He tells them to find what it is they love to do, what makes them come alive, because what the world needs is people who have come alive. So I think the strongest activism we can do is to find what we love and do it, both for ourselves, but also in service to our community.
Mhm.
And if writing is what you love, I think to follow that passion, but the other part of it is grit, it's persistence, it's showing up. It's, I kept saying that, stories surprise you, that things come in that you didn't know, but so much of writing is also revision. And you go back and you weave and you connect and you discard. And then with an editor, in my case, wonderful editor Amy Gash, my agent, a wonderful editor, Stuart Bernstein, a third set, fourth set of eyes and ears and listening, because a story is also about communication and community and getting that feedback, but feedback that helps you open up the story, not shuts you down into but what's difficult is finding a way to do that and make a living. And you've chosen farming, another thing that's hard to make a living at.
We have a few. Thank you for this wonderful advice. It's definitely, I like the Rilke quote that you mentioned, and Rilke, and I'm gonna stay thinking about that. So thank you. One person asked, of all the characters you have written, which one do you see yourself most in and why? Was that intentional or did it happen organically?
Oh, I think that any character that I write, while I'm writing that character, I really do become that character in a sense. I mean, move and breathe and try to understand, do research that helps me know even what they wore as underwear, in saving the world. I have an 18th century woman, and I learned all about the clothing and, what life in an orphanage would have been like. I move, and a bit like Keats talked about negative capability that a writer must have, where you almost cancel yourself out and become these others that you're writing about. So I think in that sense, whatever character I'm writing about, I feel very, very much that character. And by the same token, they are inheriting my DNA, my literary DNA, so that part of who I am gets into their makeup as well. But of course, because so much of what I talked about with Gaps on the Shelf was not finding my own voice, not finding Latina characters that were in novels and stories that I was reading when we first got to this country. I very much feel close to Latina characters, whether it's the Mirabar sisters, whether it's Antonia, whether it's the sisters in Garcia Girls. But that said, I think whenever we write a character, we become that character.
Yeah.
This
would be the time for other people. Thanks for answering that community question. For other people listening on the Facebook live stream to ask questions, to take advantage of Julia Alvarez being here with us tonight. Another person asked, what is an important takeaway from a book you have read or written that changed your life and how you view life?
Wow. Oh boy. A takeaway. I think I'm trying to come up with an answer that answers that question rather than diverting it, because I think when I come out of a book that has really moved me, I I don't have anything that I can extract from it separate from the experience of having been immersed in it. And that immersion is what I come away, I think, enlarged. And that is the takeaway, that it's sort of like I become a bigger version of myself for having lived through that world of that character. I've read so much and listened to audiobooks. Believe it or not, when I had this eye surgery and I couldn't read, I got an audiobook, and of all things, I don't know why I did this to myself. I've never read the Iliad.
You finally listened
I got
to
the
it.
audiobook, and I thought this will make me feel better, because it's all about war. And I just inhabited that world and just began to understand, really, when on the news comes, these devastated landscapes, these refugees, these people in bombed places in Syria and other places. I visually understood that world, and there wasn't like a takeaway. There was just a kind of enlarging. And so I think that's what I get from books. I just read recently that Mark Twain was asked what was the message in one of his books, and he said, message? Had I wanted to send a message, I would have sent a telegram. It's just nothing I can extract, but just coming through that world. I've been it's sort of like Antonia with broken English. I've been shattered and reassembled through the experience of reading that book. I'm now reading The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois by Honoré Fannin Jeffers. Oh my goodness. It is monumental. And I feel totally immersed in this narrative of, this African American family over generations. And it's just a total reframing of self that happens when I read. I also was listening and reading both Cloud Cuckoo Land, this new Anthony Doerr novel, which is all about story and narrative and its importance. But that's to say that's the takeaway, is to sort of really collapse it into a little envelope. And it's so huge, but it's the need for narrative, how we understand and make meaning of the world. And that's something stories have always known, but it's the experience of these 4 or 5 narratives woven together in that novel that really stretches that idea and makes it huge and large and part of the spirit and part of the heart and part of the body. That's also really important when I'm reading a book, that on the level of language and narrative, that the rhythm, it has to also, at the level of the heartbeat, be a takeaway too, that it gets in under my skin. And I mean that physically too, which is why I like many times Honoré Fannin Jeffers. She's a poet, and this is her debut novel, but she's been writing poetry, and I can tell when I am reading that novel.
Yeah. So it sounds like you've been reading a lot during this pandemic. And thank you for all these. I've been writing down these suggestions because I'm excited too.
Well, by the way, I always need structure. There you go, just like Antonia. And so when the pandemic happened, I needed a project. And so I decided, I love Emily Dickinson, and I know all the little famous ones that are anthologized, but she wrote 1,789 poems. And I decided that I would read 4 every day. Why 4? I don't know. They're like little riddles, and they do take time to read.
Mhm.
And just a few days ago, I finished reading all of the poems, and I felt like I was grieving
Mm.
that it was over, because living with her was such a wonderful companion through this enclosed, reclusive, shut up time, because that was very much her world.
Mhm.
Very much she sequestered herself, quarantined herself.
Yeah.
And so she was a real companion. And so now, but I feel like lines are in my head from Emily Dickinson. Yeah.
Wow. Have you been doing much writing? That's the last question from the community is, thanks for answering that you've been reading Emily Dickinson. And if you think you will write about the pandemic in some future story.
Oh, I just hope I have some time left to finish all the stories in me. And I do have, when you say, when I used to fuss at my students when they would say they have an idea for a story, as if it's all up here. But I do have an idea for a pandemic story that if time allows, I would love to be able to write. And I have several manuscripts that I'm such a perfectionist. I'm never satisfied, and I do one draft, and I'm really excited about it. Then I read it, and it's not right yet. It's not right yet. And so there are at least 2 or 3 not right yet. And
that's definitely exciting for us, though.
And good luck with your writing, Esperanza.
I really appreciate that.
What were you? Are you going to publish under both names? Or are you going to have
I actually like Esperanza Luz. I like writing under Esperanza Luz, which is 2 women on either side of my family had that name. And so I kind of adopted it.
I love that. I love both Esperanza and Luz. What a wonderful.
Yeah,
yes.
So
if you open the next Alvarez novel and there's a character named that, please forgive me. I'll give you credit.
I'd be happy to read that. I know it's late where you are. It's already 9 p.m. So I just wanted to thank you for your sacred time. I really appreciate the opportunity to being able to talk about Afterlife with you. And I wish you a beautiful night. And I think Suzanne's here to close off our evening.
Thank you, Esperanza. Wonderful questions, and your I don't know, presence and lack of pretension and curiosity were really wonderful.
Thank you.
Suerte.
Thank you both. What a gift to spend the evening with the 2 of you. Thank you for sharing your conversation with all of us. And thank you to everyone who has joined us on the live stream. We will be voting for the next One Book, One Broomfield author before too long, and hopefully we will get to do that in person. But thank you so much for joining us today. And if you want to purchase a signed copy of Afterlife, you can do that through Book Bar in Denver. The link for that is in the chat. And that is our evening. Thank you, everyone.